So this is Dundee, and this is what my PowerPoint's going to be about. I'm going to talk a bit about what we teach, and I'm also going to talk about what studying at Dundee will be like. Obviously, it's a fabulous place, but I would say that, wouldn't I? Okay, so don't just take my word for it. Here are some of our recent rankings, which are pretty impressive by any standards. I don't think we'd be coming near the top of these kinds of league tables as frequently as we do, you know, if there wasn't some kind of, you know, some substance behind it. And indeed, you know, this has been I'm quite an old lag as it happens. I've been teaching at Dundee for quite a while, and you know, I've seen this pattern repeat itself. So these are, as it were, some independent testimonials, which are pretty impressive. And indeed, in the 2020 National Student Survey, as you can see from this slide here, English, creative writing and film studies were all joint first in the UK. And I thought I'd also stick in a little plug for a recent graduate of ours, Rebecca Reed, who was judged top researcher in English in Europe. Rebecca graduated in 2020, and I had the pleasure of examining her dissertation and her teaching her for her final year's subjects at Dundee. So that's the kind of student that we can turn out. You know, the sort of heights that you might be able to aim for. Okay, so the courses at Dundee are very flexible. These are some of the subjects that you can take with English: film studies, history, philosophy, languages, creative writing, and increasingly we're offering undergraduate modules in comics as well, because we're also the home of UK home for comics studies, and we have a comics masters and many comics PhDs in the past. And indeed, many of these subjects, film studies, creative writing, comics, and so on, fall within the remit of English colleagues, and many of us teach on these other subject areas as well as teaching literature. Okay, so this is what the structure of the degree looks like. You're probably most interested in coming into level 1, although you can get advanced entry into level 2 if you have advanced hires or A levels. At level 1, you normally study 6 modules, and those can be taken from 2 to 4 different subject areas. Although you'll probably sign up, you know, for a kind of notional pathway in English or in English with something else. But we've also got this extremely flexible undergraduate pathway called liberal arts, where you can study 6 modules from up to 6 different subject areas, as well as graduating in liberal arts, you know, which is a way of kind of tailoring your own sort of degree program from the options which are available to you. And as you can see on that in that red column, the variety of subjects that you can take alongside English are enormous at Dundee. And then in level 2 is similar. So there are normally 6 modules again from 2 to 4 subject areas. And the same pattern applies to liberal arts, but also the same range of subject areas from applied languages right through to psychology. But also, you know, kind of including things like environmental science and even mathematics. We always get a certain number of graduates in joint graduates in English and maths every year. Things narrow down a little bit, become more specialised at level 3. So if you pass level 1 and level 2 successfully, and they're pass-fail years, as it were, you then enter what's known as the honours years in the Scottish system. And normally that means beginning to specialise, so perhaps, you know, choosing to study single honours English or a joint degree with another subject, or even sticking to the liberal arts pathway, which gives you even more flexibility. because again, you can continue to study 4 modules from 4 different subject areas if you within humanities, if you wish to do that. And then at level 4, we also have 4 modules per year. That's 2 in each semester, of course. And those 8 modules overall then make up the basis of the assessment that gives you your degree classification. Although there's now a slight weighting towards level 4, because obviously people are producing their best work when they really hit their stride in their 4th year. And the sort of greeny blue box details again the number of subject area, the number of subjects that you could be studying at levels 3 and 4, depending on whether you go for single honours, for a joint honours, or for the liberal arts pathway. But you'll obviously graduate with a named honours degree in, English and something, or single honours English, or indeed liberal arts. Okay, so just moving on, we also give our students the opportunity to study abroad. Obviously, the Erasmus system is winding down, but that is going to be replaced with the new Turing system. And we hope that our existing partnerships will continue, and indeed they will expand. So we'll be adding even more partner institutions to the roster of available places where you might study abroad. Okay, so teaching and learning. These are some examples of teaching and learning spaces at the university. This is, of course, a lecture theatre at the top, and these are small study spaces in the university library. But this is basically what we do at sub-honours level. That's levels 1 and 2. Most of the modules that you'll take that are taught by English, or indeed across humanities as a whole, will be based on 2 one-hour lectures a week, and then a 1.5-hour workshop. That will be a smaller group that you'll be working with, and the format will vary a little bit, depending on whether that's in English or in history or in creative writing and so on. And at level 4, you get fewer lectures, but the group teaching is expanded a little bit. So you've got a 2-hour seminar rather than a relatively shorter 1.5-hour workshop. And we use a very, very wide range of assessment. So it's not just writing essays or practical criticisms or whatever. There are class presentations which can be done through things like PowerPoint. There are source exercises if you're working on particular materials, maybe even using the archives. We've got examples of things like wiki projects, weekly journals, which are kind of written up, in response to whatever your text or topic you're studying that week, and also some conventional exams as well. So not everyone likes exams, of course, but some people, thrive in that kind of format. So we tend to have quite a mixed economy. And when you reach level 4, you'll also get the opportunity to produce a more in-depth piece of research work in the form of the dissertation or some kind of creative outcome, if that's within the creative writing domain. So just passing on what we teach. So let's go into a little bit more detail with level 1 English at this point. Okay, so level 1 English, you have only 2 modules. There's 1 module per semester, because at that level you'll also be studying a variety of other subjects, as is the pattern in the Scottish system. So the first semester module really does what it says on the tin. It introduces you to literary study. It sort of equips you to be able to engage with the 3 principal genres of literature, which of course are drama, poetry, and various forms of fiction. It'll also kind of equip you with close reading skills, if you don't have them already, and if you do, it will sort of help you to hone them. And these are some of the kinds of writers and texts that we focus on. So it's a bit of a smorgasbord in semester one, but it's also, as I say, focused on genre and form and the basic toolkit of literary study at university. And then in the second semester, we have a new module, which is called Approaches to Reading. And this is designed to kind of introduce you to a number of kind of key themes which are relevant to the study of literature. It focuses on a weekly core text, and that's read in conjunction with a relevant extract of criticism or theory. I do a little bit of lecturing myself on that particular module, so I'll be giving you the lecture on literariness. You know, how we can define what actually makes a text literary, as opposed to just any other piece of writing. And we're using the famous theory of defamiliarization in that context. But you'll also be introduced to all sorts of other ideas which relate to the collaborative work that goes on between an author and a reader in producing, as it were, the meaning of the text. Okay, so the other first year module that we're very heavily involved with, and in actual fact, I was convening this module myself for a couple of years, is an interdisciplinary humanities module called Human Futures. And I can well recommend this to you. It's an extremely interesting module to do. And it's also assessed by a group project rather than by, you know, individual essays. The group project consists of a report, a PowerPoint presentation, and also a creative poster, you know, which last year was submitted in digital form for obvious reasons. Although we are intending, you know, conditions allowing, to go back as much as possible to face-to-face teaching from this autumn, at least in small groups, as it were. Lectures will continue to be delivered, you know, through online recordings. But Human Futures is extremely exciting. It enables you to work with students who might have different specialisms from yourself, and to kind of pool your skills and knowledge into creating a project based on sort of current trends, but then extrapolated into a future scenario. In which hopefully things turn out a little bit more optimistically than they do in this cartoon image of Martians, as it were, attacking 19th century Dundee, which is from one of our comics productions around the War of the Worlds, which I might say a little bit more about in a moment. Okay, and at level one, you've also got the option to take creative writing. There's now, as it were, a joint English and creative writing degree available here, which is becoming very popular and is very engaging. So the introduction to creative writing, you know, sits alongside the introduction to literary studies, and it gives you, again, some of those kind of foundational skills that will enable you to you know, to maximize your critical and creative abilities, because of course writers are also readers. Okay, so passing on to film, which also falls within the English domain. So a lot of us teach across that boundary between literature and film. That's one of the things that I do myself. So we've got a kind of introduction to film studies, you know, which sort of equips you with the kind of equivalent abilities to be able to take films apart, to kind of analyze how films are constructed and how they produce meaning in the way that literary texts do. And there's a lot of crossover between the two, of course, because of course films are dependent on scripts, and many works of poetry and fiction are written in a cinematic mode these days, because, you know, words and images are interfused in that way. And then in the second semester, we've got a wonderful treat for you, classic Hollywood cinema, which focuses on the different key Hollywood genres, you know, melodrama, the Western, the musical, and so forth. Okay, so moving on to level 2. Level 2 is structured around period modules to, kind of introduce you to the major periods following on from the Renaissance onwards. So the first of these is literature and society, which, as you can see, sort of starts with texts such as, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus and Daniel Defoe's foundational novels, but then moves on to the late 18th and early 20th century. So we'll be looking at the Romantics, and we'll also be focusing on a Dundee text, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Mary Shelley was in Dundee for a couple of years and freely admitted in her 1831 preface that, the foundations of her imagination and literary craft were laid in this city. Although she wrote Frankenstein, of course, while in Switzerland, but nonetheless, kept coming back to Dundee because of this. The way that her imagination had been kind of stimulated by this extraordinary place. And then in the second semester, we move on from the early 19th century into the Victorian period, and then give you a kind of survey which takes you through the kinds of contexts with which literature has engaged, really from the Victorian period up to the contemporary. So, we begin by looking at Charles Dickens's Hard Times, which is about the coming of modernity through industrialism. But we also focus on Victorian poets. We look at H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds as a kind of satire of the high point of British colonialism. And then we move forward in time to late 20th and early 20th century writers such as Angela Carter, who famously kind of rewrote traditional fairy tales and myths in texts such as the Bloody Chamber, but also challenged the patriarchal structures that lay behind them. And we also look at sort of regional and different kinds of identities, such as queer identities, through the importance of through Oscar Wilde's work. And level 2 for cinema functions in a similar kind of way. The first semester focuses in on national cinemas, whether that's British, Japanese, Italian, or German. It kind of supplements, the focus on Hollywood in the first year. And in the second semester, we do come back to Hollywood, but to one of Hollywood's most influential film genres, which is arguably still very active in contemporary filmmaking. So, a wonderful treat in store through that focus on film noir. And creative writing runs concurrently too in level 2. So there are two, again, creative writing modules at level 2: practicing creative writing, which builds on what you've learned, the skills that you've developed from the first year, but also deepens your engagement with the skills of editing and responding critically to other people's work. And you'll then go on to be able to produce a range of creative texts in different forms and genres, whether that's poetry or the short story or some other kind of literary mode. And in the second semester, prose, poetics, and practice focuses in on the reading and writing of real and remembered spaces. So it's more kind of topographical or geographical in its focus, but it's also about the way that we imagine or reconstruct spaces through memory. And we now have a new module at level 2 as well, which is proving very, very popular. It's again, it's rather interdisciplinary. It's a bit like Human Futures. And this module focuses on gender, sexuality, and culture. And it's based on both, looking at that subject area through a wide field of approaches and theories, but also a combination of different types of cultural production of texts in inverted commas, which includes things like comics and film alongside more traditional literary forms, but also, as it were, takes into account how things like gender and sexuality intersect with questions of race, class, and environmentalism. So it's a very, very innovative and exciting new module. Okay, so I haven't got time to go into too much detail about what happens at levels 3 and 4, but I can give you a kind of sketch of that. So at level 3, of course, you're studying fewer options, but doing modules which are in more depth and detail. They also have a higher credit rating as well, you know, which matches the greater depth and detail in them. So in the first semester, you have a choice from that you know, that top list on this slide. Again, creative writing, literary studies, film, they're all, as it were, represented within that. So, you know, there's plenty to choose from. And if you are constructing a certain pathway through the degree, you know, whether that's English and film or English and creative writing, or, you know, going for the kind of more bespoke model of the of liberal arts, then you can very easily do that, continue that process at level 3. The second semester also includes a kind of comics module, if you like, because, you know, comics, as I say, is one of our specialisms. We don't yet have an English and comic studies undergraduate degree, but that's one of our longer term aims. We certainly have a comics master's. So the pictured page is a way of thinking about the relationship between word and image that is, you know, kind of essential to how comics work, but also to the you know, the sort of higher art form of the genre, you know, to the so-called graphic novels and so on. And the rest of that particular list in semester 2, you know, goes on to kind of cover the different strands in film and in creative writing. But we've also at level 3 as well, we also kind of broaden things out into study of the earlier periods too. So you'll have noticed that in the first semester there's a module which focuses specifically on medieval literature, but then, as it were, looks at how the legacy of the Middle Ages has been kind of remediated through you know, medieval films, or films with a kind of medieval subject matter or ethos. Okay, and at level 4, you get the opportunity to really specialize if you want to. So we have a dissertation option, which can be taken in either semester, and that's a supervised piece of research of 8,000 to 10,000 words, which is conducted under advice from the departmental specialist in whatever it is you want to write about, you know, whether that's in literary studies or whether that's in film or whether that's in a crossover with some other genre, such as comics. Creative writing also continues, as does film as well. So at level 4, it was traditional to sort of offer specialisms based on, you know, the particular sort of research interests of individual members of staff, although that's broadened out a little bit. But as you can see, it's nonetheless an extremely exciting and very diverse roster of possibilities. In semester 2, I was running an H.G. Wells science fiction and film module myself, but that's actually going to be relaunched as a science fiction and film module, which will be much more broadly based and will kind of cover Mary Shelley's work really up to contemporary science fiction writing. And there are lots of other things going on as well. There's a lot of crossover between film and theatre that year, not least through, you know, the obvious module, the obvious special option in film and theatre itself, but also the way in which the Shakespearean corpus in particular has been remediated on film, and how, as it were, 20th century figures such as most obviously Laurence Olivier, you know, became stars who on a global basis through their remediation of Shakespeare. Okay, so that's level 4, and this is a nice image which shows how kind of scholarly and yet contemporary our approach to teaching something like Shakespeare through its 20th and 21st century remediations is. I also mentioned that you get the opportunity to work very closely with staff research specialisms, not just through level 4 options, which as I say, are more kind of specialist than sub-honours modules, but also through the publication records of individual members of staff. So if you're writing a dissertation on a particular topic, it's quite likely that you'll be guided in that by the member of staff who has most interest in that particular area, who knows most about it, and indeed who can advise you to or steer you towards a topic that would be new and exciting in that way. So these are just some examples of my own monographs, which have sponsored, as it were, different kinds of student dissertations at undergraduate level, at master's level, and indeed at PhD level as well. Okay, so how do we teach? Just briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the combination that we use between the traditional sort of classroom-based chalk and talk approach, which mercifully we're going to be able to return to, at least in a kind of cautious and still slightly socially distanced form from this September onwards, and the way in which we use the virtual learning environment at Dundee, which is based on the most up-to-date version of Blackboard Collaborate, as it were, or Blackboard Ultra rather, which also allows, as it were, us to as it were, conduct online classes, which have their kind of benefits alongside the face-to-face teaching and activities that we conduct on campus. So every single module has a vast hinterland on the virtual learning environment of kind of resources and information and activities that feed in and out of of your study and assessment on a given module. So this is just what part of the site for classic Hollywood cinema looks like. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So if and when, or as and when you come to Dundee, you'll be joining a very, very vibrant cultural community with all sorts of activities that you can get involved in, such as DURA, the Dundee University Review of the Arts, which is edited and written by staff and students. There's the Duke Theatre Company, which specialises in medieval and early Renaissance plays, but also does more modern stuff too. And we have a very vibrant programme of visiting speakers, as well as different student societies and, as it were, publications which have either run by the department or by in association with the Dundee University Students Association. Another really interesting thing that we've had great fun with over the past 6 or 7 years has been the annual UK Festival of the Humanities, Being Human, which takes place every November, and which English has very much taken the lead on. So, for the past 6 or 7 years, we've been celebrating literary anniversaries or connections between Dundee and extraordinary kind of cultural events, such as the Great Moon Hoax, the most notorious media hoax of all time, perhaps, certainly of the 19th century, which was a parody of the work of a Dundee astronomer. We also celebrated H.G. Wells at 150 by persuading, by both kind of, rewriting the text as if it were taking place in 19th century Dundee, but also persuading Dame Sue Black, the UK's foremost forensic scientist, to conduct a live Martian autopsy on stage for us. So there are great opportunities to get involved in, extraordinary kind of theatrical events as well. And the comics creative space is always very active in producing comics on the annual Being Human Festival themes. You can see an example there of a comic which celebrated Mary Shelley's time in Dundee and the various experiences that inspired her text. And in the top left-hand corner, the subject of this year's Being Human Festival is the rediscovery of the work of a lost Scottish science fiction writer who became the father of West Coast American science fiction, a man called Robert Duncan Milne, who wrote something like 100 science fiction stories, but whose work slipped through the cracks in history, but deserves, as it were, to be rated alongside that of H.G. Wells or Jules Verne. Okay, so Dundee is very much a city of culture. We have all kinds of literary and cultural festivals going on here. And we've got the Rep Theatre, we've got the Dundee Contemporary Arts, which is a very vibrant arts centre with multiple cinemas. And of course, living in Dundee is easy, as it were. The campus is pretty much in the city centre. The facilities are great. We take both a traditional and a very progressive 21st century approach. There are lots of students in the city, 16,000 at Dundee itself, at Dundee University itself, and then on top of that, we also have Abertay University and kind of shared union facilities, which are a real bonus. And of course, the city itself is changing massively. I've been here for over a quarter of a century, and I've seen it transform, into this kind of space-age waterfront where the mothership of the V&A has landed recently, where there is currently a fantastic exhibition on the design of nightclubs internationally called Night Fever. Well worth seeing if you're around in Dundee and you manage to catch it. Okay, so a few other things to talk about before I finally wind up. Job prospects as a Dundee graduate are really good. So, 96.4% of our graduates were in employment in the last higher education survey, and over 80% of Dundee graduates go on into graduate level jobs. Seamus Heaney once gave a lecture at this university where he described it as having its head in the clouds but its feet firmly on the ground. And I think that, that's a good way of sort of summing up what Dundee is about. So again, I will remind you of who I'm impersonating. That's Dr. Jennifer Barnes, if you want to get in touch with her. Jen is one of our principal contacts. So the contact for English studies, Daniel Cook. For film, it's Jen Barnes. And for creative writing, that would be Heather Young. So I'm going to wind up at that point, just move on to my final slide there and leave it in place. I'm just going to end the show, and I'm very happy to respond to any questions at this point. So I can see that there's a question just come through. A question from an audience member asking if English is a competitive course to get into. And I think that my colleague Jen Barnes is in the process of replying to that. Jen, you may remember the grades that are required either at higher or at A level to get in. Entry is actually into the School of Humanities rather than into the individual subject. But I think the information is just coming through. I think Shabnam's going to copy your response into the Q&A box. What other questions are people asking? Let me just find my way back. That seems to be the only one at present. The information, of course, is also on the website. Someone's just asked, do we offer any work experience internships for publishing, as that's the career path I would like to go into? Yes, certainly there is actually an internship module that you can take at level 2, which is run by the Career Service. So it's possible, as it were, to arrange a placement through that. If we can negotiate with a suitable publisher, either one based in Dundee or perhaps in Edinburgh, or someone that you can work for virtually, through a virtual placement, then that's eminently possible. Does that provide a satisfactory answer to the person that's just asked about internships? Okay, we've got a few more minutes left, I think, before we take a break. So don't be shy, folks. If there's something you want to ask us, if I don't have the answer myself, I can direct you to someone who will do. Jen's just replied that English is a very popular course, and we offer applicants extra ways to stand out via the application task and personal statement, for example. Jen is far more up on this than I am as our recruitment officer. Okay, so any other questions, folks? As I say, if you don't have the opportunity to ask your question today, or anything occurs to you later on, you can contact the 3 colleagues who are responsible for recruitment in the different pathways. So that's Dr. Daniel Cook for English, Dr. Jennifer Barnes for film, and Dr. Heather Young for creative writing. One more question. I'm currently in S5. What work subject experience would you recommend I do before applying? Should I apply in S5 or in S6? Well, it would be great if you could get some kind of work experience that might be relevant to sort of literary study. If it's literary study you're aiming at, or whether you're more interested in film studies, perhaps, or in a different medium. You can, of course, apply from S5 or S6. Though you may find if you stay on into the 6th form that you'll have more you'll have a wider sort of experience of literary studies, and also you may have the opportunity to do some kind of specialist study as well, which is always a good bridge, I think, into university study. Now Shabnam's just asked question, what's the application task? While someone else is fielding that, I'm being asked how many hours of outside reading for the course. That would really depend. The contact hours are not huge, in the sense that if you're at sub-honours level, if you've got 2 hours plus a 1.5 hour seminar for each module. The commitment in terms of face-to-face contact is relatively small, but you then also have to read in and around your subject. So there are set texts, as it were, that will require many more hours than that, and you may well also have online tasks as well that will kind of supplement that face-to-face contact. Apparently there is no application task for English, so we've cleared that up. Okay, so I think we've just hit the 10-minute mark. So unless there are any further questions that you'd like to ask, it's been a pleasure talking to you all. Even though I can't see your faces or hear your voices, I nonetheless feel that you're out there, and I feel your enthusiasm and your keenness, as it were, to find out more about Dundee, and hopefully to come and study here as well. So that's absolutely grand. I think my colleague Jen Barnes is finally typing some sort of final message here, so I won't sign off until that comes through and bid you goodbye until it does. Okay, so Jen is still typing. Here we go. We offer an internship module, as I pointed out, via the Careers Service. The opportunities vary year to year. That's absolutely right. I was advising a couple of second-year students about this only the other week. We have various in-house opportunities within the school for those interested in publishing related to our creative writing courses and archives, which is absolutely right. You have the opportunity to get involved in DURA, for example, and also in the publishing opportunities that come out of the university's own activities. Do we have an application task for creative writing? I believe students are encouraged to submit examples of creative work, which is presumably the equivalent to that, but I'm not aware, unless Jen knows better, I'm not aware of a specific creative writing task being set for applicants. Jen has just, again, sort of backed up what I was saying about hours of reading outside the course, depending on the modules that are taken. Modules usually require 3 hours of in-person engagement. The rest of the time is dedicated to self-directed learning. So you do have to be quite disciplined in kind of, managing your time and as it were, reading the material. And indeed, as Jen says, you learn fantastic time management skills. So you won't be in a laboratory for 5 days a week, but you will be in your head and in the library for much longer periods of time than those 3 contact hours would imply. There are no application tasks for English or creative writing. That's just been confirmed. As I say, I wasn't aware of one myself, but I believe that creative writing encouraged you to submit samples of your work. The application tasks were withdrawn because of the pandemic, so it was obviously an outcome of conditions and perhaps an understandable one. Okay, I don't think there are any unanswered questions as such. As I say, feel free to email the the colleagues who form the key points of contact for English film or creative writing, if anything occurs to you later or you want to remain in conversation with us prior to hopefully coming to study in Dundee at your earliest possible opportunity. But otherwise, I will bid you good evening at that point, and I hope to see at least some of you in the near future. Thank you very much for listening. Good night.